In my early 20s, I decided to apply to law school. This was when all law schools had their own separate applications. I don't know if that's so much the case anymore. And the local city law school in New York had one of the most interesting applications I saw. There were the usual questions that you had to answer, like why you wanted to go to law school and what you wanted to do. And then there was this odd question that stuck out. It was something like, tell us something you'd like to change about yourself. And I thought, and then I strategized about the right way to frame this answer. Maybe to make something sound good that was actually kind of bad, the job interview response, like, well, I'm kind of a perfectionist, that kind of essay answer. I thought about what the traits of a good lawyer were, and finally I decided to write an essay on my tendency to have just a little bit of righteous indignation from time to time, just a touch. I know my parents are on this, so they might have a word to say about that. I told a story once about walking out of a summer job where I was treated unfairly, where I knew what was right. And I explained in the essay that it might come from a good impulse, but it can lead sometimes in my life to hard situations. I was so proud of my essay, so I shared it with my roommate, with whom I'd moved to New York City, and he'd known me since freshman year of high school and probably knew me as well as anyone. I figured he'd see what I was going for in the essay, my smart little subtle way of making a problem I had actually sound good. And he's an excellent songwriter, so he knows writing. He read it, saw the examples, looked up and said, "Yep, this is you. It would be good to work on that righteous indignation, man." He might have laughed a little bit about it, but I did not. So as we discussed in last week's sermon, we're in the middle of a 3-sermon series about the fundamentals of a life of faith, and more specifically, how this movement, the Unitarian Universalist movement, draws on these fundamentals in unique ways. Last week I shared about what being wrong about a situation might afford us, and we focused on the recognition of being wrong or seeing another history as a way of increasing our ways of knowing and understanding. Some might call this first part of a life of faith learning. And I spoke about the role Unitarian ancestors actually played in educational institutions which trained many of the first colonial missionaries to arrive on these islands, and the idea of decolonization. Now, based on the messages I received after that sermon, there seems to be a lot of energy around this process and what it means. And there are many questions about how to do it. Indeed, there seems to be a mountain of information to climb about this topic, and it's a journey we won't complete in just a few sermons, friends. But since the parks that let us climb mountains outdoors are closed now, maybe we can scale a mountain inside each one of us together. And this is fitting because the second area of life of faith that we are looking at this week as we venture through this month who Sue so beautifully explains its theme is transformation. This sermon, though, is about justice. Now, this is a Unitarian Universalist church, and we know who we are. Justice is at the center of a lot of what we do. In fact, so much so that my colleagues in faiths other than ours regularly are picking my brain about what the latest justice initiative of our church and our movement is. Now, I think they're looking for sermon ideas sometimes, but maybe they just want to know what's coming up in the next 5 years when they finally get to where we are, when they finally catch up. But for decades, many in the world of faith have recognized our movement as being out in front of a wide range of issues that are seeking justice where that justice is lacking. And I'll tell you, friends, it feels really good. It feels good to be on the right side of justice issues. It feels warm and cozy being on the right side of history. I can almost taste that old familiar flavor I knew so well. What is that? Oh, yes. Righteousness. But righteousness was not invented when I stormed out of a summer job for being treated unfairly. No. In fact, the concepts of justice and righteousness have been intertwined for millennia. Some think of them actually as interchangeable in certain works. The word righteousness, though, it smacks a little of something of those faiths from which many of us sought a refuge. Justice seems more palatable, an expression of what we are seeking in the world. But this is another one of those things, friends. If we let those prior faiths keep us from looking at these ideas on our own, well, that's just not right. And we don't like it. We want to be right. So, one of my favorite renderings of a description of righteousness comes actually from the Quran, on the verse aptly titled, "The Verse of Righteousness." In it, God reveals to the Prophet Muhammad, mercy and blessings upon him, the meaning of righteousness. He says in part that the righteous person, quote, gives wealth in spite of love for it to relatives, orphans, the needy, the traveler, those who ask for help, and for freeing slaves, and who establishes prayer and gives zakah, which means obligatory prayer, those who fulfill their promise when they promise, and those who are patient in poverty and ailment and during battle. Those are the ones who have been true, and it is those who are the righteous. It's strange, I read it over and over, and I don't hear anything about tossing an apron to the floor and storming out of a restaurant in there. No. Giving to others, keeping promises, being patient in adversity. Part of what I notice here in this text is the simplicity of it. These are small, private actions, maybe really habits, that are taken or adopted by the person who seeks to be righteous. And faiths throughout time and over the span of the earth also contemplate these two concepts and how they are related. And it is no different, friends, in these lands. Who can tell me what the closest Hawaiian word to righteousness might be? I got two people here. Anyone? Pono. Pono is about as close as we can get. Now, it's with deep humility I speak now about a language that is not my own. So any grace that can be shown and any corrections you might make are both greatly and warmly welcomed, ideally after the sermon if possible. Those of you living in these lands might know that the Hawaiian state motto is Ua Mauke Ea Aka Aina Ika Pono. It's translated as the sovereignty of the land is perpetuated in what? In righteousness. The Hawaiian dictionary compiled by Mary Kavena Pukui and Samuel H. Elbert and published by the University of Hawaii Press has 6 different definitions in Hawaiian and more than 80 different meanings of pono translated into English. So I dare say an English speaker might never fully grasp the entire meaning of pono. But there in the motto, adopted by Hawaii upon statehood in 1959, is a commonly understood and long-standing meaning of pono, righteousness. Now, we've spoken before about these churchy words. Words that our more dogmatic and orthodox sibling faiths seem to love to use as much as possible, and they sound really, really great in those big fiery sermons that we may have heard as children, or maybe that we've seen on TV or movies. And righteousness is one of those words, right? You can almost hear a preacher adding a few syllables to it to make it land home. Righteousness. Now, I believe in reclaiming these powerful and meaningful words for our own faith, for a faith, a movement that can give them new and meaningful life. Now, don't get me wrong. I love justice. I want justice to roll down like waters upon all of us, but justice, by and large, is something that happens outside of us in the ways we create and participate in movements, in the ways fates of others are decided by systems that will take years, decades, generations to change. In order for there really to be justice, righteousness must come first. And friends, there are times for me when I realize I have not moved so far away from my early 20s as the generation in between might suggest. I only have to recall a conversation on Friday about how incomprehensible to me the idea is of arguing against wearing a facial covering right now in public settings. I was going off, friends, while wearing a mask, I promise. I was talking with two friends at the time, and with righteous anger and moral certitude, I would have cast those non-mask wearing sinners into the fiery pits of hell if our faith believed in such a place. But no, I wouldn't really do that. But this stripe of righteous indignation running down my back is not totally gone. As I wrote in the essay a generation ago, I hope it comes from a sense of fair play, but it presents in ways that aren't as helpful to me or those around me. Oh my, when I am right and you are wrong, I can be a lot to handle. Stop laughing, Stuart. That's right. But I'm not alone. When our movement, and even at times our church, does justice work, a lot of the time the work is something public and visible, like a parade. And I've made myself pretty clear about parades. The two parades we participate in most, the Gay Pride Parade and the Martin Luther King Jr. Parade, are wonderful. They really are. And bringing live music to those events is frankly a gift and a blessing from our amazing spirits to our wider community. I've said it before, I love the looks on people's faces when they realize the spirits are actually singing live. People kind of light up, like they're surprised, they start kind of dancing. It is wonderful to see. And from another perspective, in a sense, our church participates in those parades so that the idea of the parade reflects well on our church. We get a little credibility from taking part in the parade, right? But are parades doing the work of justice? Are they advancing the cause of righteousness, the individual, personal ways of interacting with those around us, giving to others, keeping promises, patient in adversity? I'm not sure. But I do know that the Social Justice Council is actually going to step back from organizing parade participation going forward. But don't worry, this is actually a perfect time to do it because the LGBT Legacy Foundation, the host and organizer of the Pride Parade, has already canceled the parade for October 17th due to the pandemic. So there's plenty of time to plan, don't worry, who will take this work on in the future. Instead, the Legacy Foundation is donating funds to their partner organizations serving so many in this vulnerable community and encouraging others to do the same. In a sense, the group who so regularly hosts this outward expression of support and solidarity is finding a way to look inward at its core mission, to give to others, to keep the promises they make, and to be patient in adversity. And this inward look is at the heart of righteousness, of surveying the situation we find ourselves in and making things pono. Cornel West is famous for saying that justice is what love looks like in public. Well, if that's the case, then righteousness is what justice looks like in us. I spoke last week about decolonization, and Dero Farrar spoke some about that as well in our Pauhana. And, as I said, I got some comments and emails about this subject this week. Some were afraid and others were excited about what the link between decolonization and the movements for Hawaiian sovereignty might mean. So I want everyone to just take a breath, just relax. I'm not advocating a church-wide position on Hawaiian sovereignty. A settler colonist like myself, who's been here for not even quite 3 years, and was trained as a minister at the very place that sent scores and scores of settler ministers to this island 2 centuries ago, is not the person to lead a discussion on Hawaiian sovereignty. Now, Hawaiian sovereignty is one form that justice, the actions seen in the world, how love looks in public, might come to be someday. We don't know what the future will hold. Decolonization is a process. both external and internal, of recognizing the ways that dominant cultural forces work in our lives, in our brains, and impact the very ways of understanding this world. Some of my views, no matter how hard I will try, will always be the views of a kind or a type of tourist. They're coming from a colonial standpoint. It is not a judgment. I'm not judging. It's just a fact. Other of my views, for example, knowing that the way I love others is seen as outside the norm for our society, come from a standpoint of someone who has been colonized, who still fears retaliation for holding the hand of a person they love in public. My love looks different in public still. I want us really to gather any of those feelings that come up from the colonized perspective and try to imagine the pain and resentment one might feel. To know and see the land of their ancestors, to hear and tell stories of how that land was taken and the manner that land was taken, and then to read Ua mau ke ea aka aina I kapono. The sovereignty of the land is perpetuated in righteousness. I'm about as likely to fully understand the meaning of pono as I am to understand what that must feel like inside, and still, I'm going to try. I was admitted to that law school, and I remember when a professor from that school called with a follow-up on my admission. She asked if I had any questions, and I said I decided to go to a school with a stronger business focus rather than the justice focus of their school because I wanted to do corporate law. She was a little stunned, said, "Okay, well, best of luck," and ended the call. Now, I don't regret that decision for a lot of reasons, but I don't mind telling you that for the next decade, my life changed, and in many ways, not for the better. The internal struggles every 20-something has were magnified in the ways I was not treating myself well. It was not until I decided that I wanted to serve others in a life of faith as my life's work that things started to turn around. It was not until I started really to consider what justice looks like on the inside that I could even fathom what it was really supposed to look like in public. And I was a lawyer, friends. Justice was supposed to be my profession. See, this element of faith, of our movement, righteousness, or justice, is one of the hardest elements we have to grasp. It requires a lot of listening, a lot of understanding, and a lot of patience. And there is fear, I know, that even beginning a conversation like decolonization could cause pain and conflict externally in our church or in the community, but please believe me, not having a conversation about decolonization is already causing pain and conflict internally for many of us. As a movement that rises to the occasions that are right, we will have setbacks. In fact, someone cut down the Black Lives Matter banner from our church sign this past week. We just viewed it. Someone probably took a box cutter. They cut all the bungee cords and all the zip ties. Well, they didn't get all the zip ties, did they, Stuart? And I may not know the language, but I know that is not Pono. As a movement that rises to meet the challenges facing those among us who are suffering, who have been wronged, who must risk peace of mind at times, all through our community, many of us are witnessing the limits of what a civil society can accomplish in the face of its gravest threats, and it's distressing to watch. I'm feeling it today, friends, and I know you are too, and I know so much of what we are feeling. It is not Pono. As a movement that rises up to meet the day when new ways of thinking, new ways of believing, new ways of understanding dawn upon the world, that rises up to scale the mountains that keep us from righteousness in our midst, that rises up to the summit of those mountains to see more clearly, to see more fully, to touch more truly the hardest places to find out in the world, to wring out justice. we must also look to the peaks we have to summit in our own selves, where we might rise there to know righteousness. For it is only in this journey that we may find ua mau ke ea aka aina I ka pono. May it ever be so. Blessed be, and amen.
You're broken down and tired of living life on a merry-go-round, and you can't find the fighter